5 bullets, Brussels, March 22, 1990. Gerald Bull died unlocking his apartment door with papers for a supergun scattered at his feet, a weapon designed to strike Israeli cities from 600 miles away. The killer walked away into the night and was never identified. This is the story of why a brilliant engineer became a target, how 3 intelligence services coordinated his elimination, and the moment he realized he'd made a fatal mistake. Bull's body was discovered at 7:45 in the evening by his building superintendent on Rue Cherid. 3 shots to the back of the head, 2 to the neck. Professional grouping with a 7.65 millimeter pistol, probably a Beretta fitted with a suppressor. His briefcase had fallen open, technical drawings spilling across the marble floor. His keys were still in the lock where he'd inserted them, seconds before the first bullet struck. No one heard the shots. The superintendent only found him because another resident complained about a door standing open on the second floor. Bull's apartment was dark inside. The blood pool had already begun to congeal in the cold March air. Inspector Andre Desmet from Brussels Judicial Police arrived within the hour and knew immediately this wasn't a robbery. Bull's wallet contained 2,000 Belgian francs, untouched. His watch was still on his wrist. This was execution. The briefcase contents told the real story. Technical specifications for Project Babylon, a supergun with a barrel over 100 meters long and a caliber of 1 meter. The weapon could fire 2,000-pound projectiles to ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers or launch payloads into low Earth orbit. Saddam Hussein was paying Gerald Bull millions to build it. Bull was 3 months from completing the first prototype when someone decided he needed to die. But the story doesn't start with the assassination. It starts 28 years earlier with a young genius who thought engineering existed separate from consequences. Gerald Bull earned his PhD from the University of Toronto at 23, the youngest engineering doctorate the university had ever awarded. His thesis on supersonic aerodynamics caught the attention of Canadian military researchers who were building artillery testing facilities along the Vermont border. By 1961, Bull was running the program and solving ballistics problems that had stumped researchers for decades. His breakthrough was simple in concept but revolutionary in execution: reshape the artillery shell for optimal aerodynamics and extend the barrel length to maximize muzzle velocity. Standard 155 mm howitzers could fire about 15 kilometers. Bull's modifications pushed that to 40 kilometers with no loss in accuracy. The Canadian and American military establishments took notice. This young engineer was making artillery relevant again in an age of missiles and bombers. The high-altitude research project was Bull's dream, given institutional backing. He convinced the U.S. Army and Navy to fund development of a massive gun that could fire instrumented projectiles into the upper atmosphere, cheaper than rockets for meteorological research, he argued. The installation was built on Barbados in 1962, where the Caribbean location allowed firing over open ocean. The gun had a 16-inch barrel that was 120 feet long, pointed at the sky at a 45-degree angle. Bull's team fired the first test shot in January 1963. The projectile reached an altitude of 92 kilometers, higher than many early rocket launches. Subsequent tests pushed projectiles past the boundary of space. Bull had proven his concept. A gun could reach space altitudes at a fraction of rocket costs. The military applications were obvious to everyone, but Bull insisted he was advancing pure science. Funding collapsed in 1967. The space race focused on rockets. ICBMs dominated strategic planning. Artillery seemed antiquated. NASA had no interest in gun-launched satellites. The Pentagon concluded that missiles provided better flexibility than fixed ground installations. The HARP facility was abandoned. Bull's life's work became an engineering curiosity, gathering dust in the Caribbean heat. He refused to let the dream die. Bull established Space Research Corporation in 1968, operating facilities on both sides of the U.S.-Canada border. His business model was straightforward: Sell artillery improvements to anyone willing to pay. No questions about end use. No moral reservations about clients. Engineering was engineering, and consequences were the responsibility of those who fired the guns, not those who designed them. South Africa became his primary customer in the 1970s. The apartheid government faced international arms embargoes, but needed artillery for their border wars in Angola and Namibia. Bull provided the G5 howitzer, a 155 mm gun that could fire 42 kilometers, outranging anything Cuban or Angolan forces possessed. He manufactured components at his Vermont facility, shipped them through front companies labeled as mining equipment, and collected payment in untraceable transfers through Swiss accounts. The operation was sophisticated and profitable until 1980, when customs inspectors in Antigua intercepted a shipment of 35,000 artillery shells manifested as mining supplies, but clearly stamped for military use. U.S. authorities arrested Bull on conspiracy charges related to illegal arms exports. His lawyers negotiated a plea agreement, reduced charges, substantial fines, and 4 months in a federal prison. The conviction destroyed his American operations, but his reputation as an artillery innovator was secure. His ex-wife visited him once in prison. The conversation was brief and bitter. She asked him why he couldn't work for legitimate clients, why he needed to arm dictators and circumvent international law. Bull's response captured his entire worldview. He was an engineer solving technical problems. The political decisions about how to use his designs were made by others. Moral responsibility rested with those who chose targets and pulled triggers, not with those who made the weapons more effective. She left without saying goodbye. They never spoke again. China hired him after his release in 1984. The People's Liberation Army wanted to upgrade their artillery capabilities, and Bull's extended-range designs offered proven advantages. He traveled to Beijing repeatedly, consulting on barrel metallurgy and propellant chemistry. The contracts were legal, no sanctions prohibited arms sales to China at that time, but they demonstrated Bull's willingness to work with authoritarian regimes that valued technical capability over political compatibility. His children tried to maintain relationships despite growing concerns about his work. His daughter, Michelle, called him from Montreal in 1987 after reading a news article about the South African artillery sales. She asked if he understood what his guns were being used for, who they were killing. Bull dismissed her concerns with the same rationalization he'd offered his ex-wife. He was an engineer. The weapons would exist regardless. He might as well be the one designing them properly. Michelle stopped calling after that conversation. The silence between them would last until his death. The Iraq opportunity emerged in 1988 through intermediaries Bull had cultivated in the international arms market. Saddam Hussein's regime wanted long-range artillery after the Iran-Iraq War demonstrated the vulnerability of fixed positions to missile attacks. Bull proposed improved versions of the G5 for Iraq's existing artillery units. The contract was worth millions. But during negotiations in Baghdad, Bull made a fateful decision. He mentioned his space gun concept, the dream he'd been chasing since Barbados. The Iraqi officials were immediately interested. Hussein personally authorized exploration of what Bull was calling Project Babylon. The specifications evolved rapidly. A gun with a barrel over 300 feet long and a bore diameter of 1 meter. It would fire projectiles weighing 2,000 pounds to ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers, or into low Earth orbit with lighter payloads. The engineering challenges were immense, but Bull insisted everything was solvable. Metallurgy for the barrel, propellant chemistry for the charge, aerodynamics for the shell. He had solutions for all of it. Bull convinced himself the project was about space access technology. He told colleagues and family that Babylon was a satellite launcher, that Iraq wanted civilian space capability, that military applications were secondary considerations. The rationalization was transparent to everyone except Bull himself. A gun that could launch satellites could obviously deliver warheads to Tel Aviv or Tehran. But acknowledging that reality meant confronting the moral implications of his work. and Bull had built his entire career on avoiding that confrontation. The contractual arrangements were deliberately opaque. Bull worked through a network of shell companies, Space Research Corporation in Brussels, Advanced Technology Institute in Athens, various entities registered in Switzerland and Liechtenstein. Iraqi payments were dispersed to manufacturers across Europe with no single transaction large enough to trigger automatic scrutiny. The program was compartmentalized, so each contractor knew only their specific component. Sheffield Forgemasters in Britain manufactured the barrel sections, believing they were producing industrial piping for a petrochemical project called PC2. The tubes required precision boring and specialized steel alloys, but nothing about the order seemed suspicious. The company had no reason to question a lucrative contract from a client with immediate payment. By early 1990, 8 massive barrel sections were completed and ready for shipment. Israeli intelligence identified Project Babylon in November 1989. Mossad had sources inside Iraq's weapons procurement network, and the massive steel shipments to a military facility north of Baghdad triggered analysis by Amman, Israel's military intelligence directorate. Initial assessments were skeptical. A gun of the size Bull proposed seemed fantastical. But as technical details emerged through signals intercepts and human sources, skepticism turned to alarm. The range calculations were devastating. Bull's Supergun could fire from central Iraq and hit Tel Aviv, Haifa, or any Israeli city with shells too large and too fast for existing defenses to intercept. The 2,000-pound projectiles could be filled with high explosives, chemical agents, or radiological materials. A sustained bombardment would overwhelm Israel's response capabilities. The strategic implications were unacceptable. Major General Ehud Barak received the intelligence briefing in December 1989. He was then serving as Deputy Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, and the assessment concluded that Babylon represented an existential threat requiring immediate action. Diplomatic pressure would be slow and uncertain. Bombing the Iraqi installation would trigger regional escalation. The optimal solution was eliminating Bull himself, terminate the project at its technical source before the weapon became operational. The decision moved through Israeli command structures with bureaucratic precision. Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir received the recommendation in January 1990 and authorized Mossad to develop operational plans. The Kidon Unit, specialists in targeted killings, began surveillance of Bull's movements in Europe. His routine in Brussels was mapped in detail over 6 weeks: office schedule, apartment location, travel patterns, security awareness. Operatives photographed him daily, timed his commutes, identified moments of vulnerability. Bull remained oblivious to the surveillance. He was focused on solving engineering problems, driving Project Babylon forward despite growing signs that Western intelligence was tracking him. His office in Brussels was filled with technical drawings and stress analysis calculations. He worked 12-hour days, confident that his genius would overcome any obstacles. The possibility that he might be killed for his work never seriously occurred to him. British Customs seized 8 barrel sections at Teesside Port on March 10, 1990. Inspectors had been tipped by MI6 to examine the steel tubes more carefully. When they discovered precision machining inconsistent with petrochemical use, they impounded the entire shipment. The tubes were clearly artillery components, despite their manifests claiming industrial purposes. The seizure was coordinated with Israeli intelligence as part of the broader effort to disrupt Babylon. Bull's response to the seizure was aggressive and revealing. He hired lawyers, contacted defense industry connections in Britain, and argued the contract was legitimate commercial business. His position was technically defensible, but ignored the obvious military reality. Most importantly, Bull made clear he wouldn't abandon the project voluntarily. He was already working on alternative supply routes through Spanish and Swiss manufacturers. The Teesside interdiction was a setback, not a termination. That determination sealed his fate. The Vienna meeting 4 days before his assassination was his fatal mistake. Bull met with 3 Iraqi officials at a hotel near the Stadt Park on March 18th. Austrian intelligence photographed the encounter and shared the images with Allied services. Bull spent 2 hours reassuring the Iraqis that Babylon could continue despite the British seizure. He spread technical drawings across the restaurant table, pointing to specific components, explaining how alternative manufacturers could replace the confiscated barrels. But something changed for Bull during that Vienna trip. His hotel room phone records, later obtained by investigators, showed he made a call to a number in Brussels on the evening of March 18th. The call lasted 17 minutes. The recipient was never identified, but analysis of Bull's subsequent behavior suggested the conversation was significant. He appeared agitated when he met the Iraqis again the following morning. His body language in surveillance photos showed tension that hadn't been visible the previous day. What Bull said in that phone call would never be definitively established, but intelligence analysts who reviewed the communications intercepts developed a theory. Bull had realized the danger he was in. The British seizure, the intensifying pressure, the complete commitment the Iraqis expected from him, the reality finally penetrated his rationalizations. He wanted to withdraw from the project. But by March 1990, Bull was in too deep. The Iraqis had paid millions. They expected delivery. Walking away wasn't an option they would accept. Bull returned to Brussels on March 20th, looking stressed according to colleagues who saw him at the office. He spent March 21st making phone calls and reviewing documents, but his usual confident energy seemed diminished. He left work early that day, unusual for him. His secretary asked if he was feeling well. Bull said he was fine, but just needed rest. It was the last time she saw him alive. The surveillance team tracking Bull for Mossad noted the change in his demeanor, but it didn't alter operational planning. Their mission was target elimination, not psychological assessment. Bull was building a weapon that threatened Israeli cities. His state of mind was irrelevant. The operation would proceed as planned. March 22nd began as a standard surveillance day. Bull arrived at his Science Park office at 9:15. The observation team positioned outside noted his arrival and settled into monitoring mode. Their encrypted radio communications used coded phrases. Subject at primary location meant Bull was at work. Subject mobile meant traveling. Subject at secondary location meant home. The shooter spent the morning at a safe house in Saint-Gilles, a corporate apartment rented under false documentation. The Beretta Model 70 pistol was already prepared, loaded with 7 rounds, suppressor attached, wrapped in cloth inside a shoulder bag. The stolen getaway car was positioned 2 blocks from Bull's apartment on Rue Sherrod. Everything was ready. The team was simply waiting for Bull to follow his routine and drive home. Bull left his office at 5:43 that afternoon. The surveillance team radioed the update immediately. The shooter departed the safe house and drove toward Uccle, timing arrival to coincide with Bull reaching his apartment. The precision was the result of 6 weeks of observation. Bull's commute time was predictable. His parking spot was consistent. The moment of maximum vulnerability, unlocking his apartment door with hands full, occurred at the same time nearly every evening. Bull's Mercedes traveled through Brussels along his usual route. Avenue Louise, Avenue Dubois, Rue Sherrod approaching. The shooter arrived at the staging position and waited, engine off, watching the street in both directions. Standard protocol: arrive early enough to ensure position, but not so early that loitering became suspicious. Bull parked on the street at 6:12 and retrieved his briefcase from the passenger seat. The surveillance team confirmed his arrival through coded transmission. The shooter exited the vehicle and began walking toward Bull's building at a measured pace. No rushing, no visible tension, just another resident returning home in the March evening, coat concealing the weapon that would be drawn in approximately 90 seconds. Bull walked to his building entrance without apparent concern. No checking over his shoulder, no hesitation. He reached his apartment door on the 2nd floor and set down his briefcase to retrieve his keys. The hallway was empty. The building was quiet. He inserted the key into the lock and turned it, hearing the mechanism click open. The shooter reached the second-floor landing as Bull pushed the door open. Training took over automatically. Smooth approach, weapon drawn and raised in one fluid motion, acquire the target's head and neck. Bull was focused on picking up his briefcase, completely unaware, vulnerable, exposed, exactly as the operational plan predicted. The first shot struck Bull at the base of the skull, severing the brainstem instantly. Death was immediate. He collapsed forward into the doorway, the briefcase falling from his hand and spilling papers across the threshold. The shooter fired 4 more times in rapid succession as Bull fell. Head, neck, professional execution, certain lethality. The suppressed gunshots made sounds like, sharp hand claps. Audible but not alarming in an urban building. The entire encounter lasted 4 seconds. The shooter withdrew immediately, walking back down the stairs at the same measured pace, weapon concealed again under the coat. No one emerged from nearby apartments. No doors opened. The building remained silent. Bull's body lay in the doorway, blood spreading across the marble floor, in the quiet aftermath of perfectly executed assassination. The shooter reached the getaway car 2 minutes later. The driver saw the approach and started the engine. They merged into evening traffic and drove at exactly the speed limit toward the extraction route that had been rehearsed multiple times. Behind them, on Rue Sherrod, Gerald Bull was dead at 62, his keys still in the lock, his Supergun diagrams scattered at his feet. The operational team reached their safe house 17 minutes after the shooting. They changed vehicles, secured weapons in a concealed compartment, and drove to separate locations. The shooter would remain in Brussels for 36 hours before departing on a commercial flight with false documentation. Standard protocol, immediate departure raised suspicions, while a brief cooling-off period appeared routine. Tel Aviv received confirmation through encrypted burst transmission that evening. The message was brief and coded. Mission complete. Team secure. No complications. The response was equally terse. Acknowledged. Proceed to extraction. No congratulations. No celebration. Professional execution of assigned mission. The strategic threat was eliminated. Bull's body was discovered 45 minutes after the shooting when the building superintendent responded to a resident complaint about an open door. The superintendent saw the blood first, then Bull's body sprawled across the threshold and immediately called police. Inspector Desmet arrived shortly after 8 o'clock and began documenting what was clearly a professional hit. The investigation moved quickly, but hit dead ends repeatedly. Forensic examination revealed the suppressed weapon and professional shot grouping. Canvass of the neighborhood produced no useful witnesses. An elderly woman, 3 doors down, reported seeing a man standing near a parked car around 6:30, but she couldn't provide a useful description. Medium height, dark coat, nothing distinctive. The car was gone by the time police arrived. Bull's briefcase contents revealed his work on Project Babylon and his Iraqi connections. Belgian intelligence service took over the investigation within 24 hours, sealing Bull's office and confiscating all files. Their involvement confirmed what Desmet already suspected. This was intelligence business, not civilian crime. The murder was connected to state security matters that extended far beyond Brussels' police jurisdiction. The international response was carefully coordinated silence. Israeli embassy officials expressed appropriate concern when contacted by Belgian authorities, but provided no substantive information. British intelligence offered investigative assistance, while revealing nothing about their own involvement in tracking Bull. CIA liaised through their Brussels station, but volunteered no details about their coordination with Allied services. The diplomatic fiction was maintained absolutely. Bull's death was a mystery. The perpetrators unknown, all governments appropriately concerned but unable to assist beyond standard law enforcement cooperation. Desmet interviewed Bull's colleagues at Space Research Corporation. His secretary described him as focused and driven, but mentioned he seemed stressed after returning from Vienna. Another colleague noted Bull had been making calls to Spanish and Swiss contacts about manufacturing alternatives after the British seizure. Everyone confirmed he was actively working to continue Babylon despite the interdiction. The evidence supported the obvious conclusion. Someone decided Bull needed to be eliminated before the project could proceed further. But knowing the general motive didn't identify specific perpetrators. Desmet's investigation documented a professional assassination almost certainly conducted by intelligence operatives, but he couldn't build a prosecutable case against suspects he couldn't identify in countries he couldn't access. The investigation would remain officially open, but realistically frozen. Intelligence operations existed in a realm where civilian law enforcement had no real authority. Belgian intelligence services liaised with Israeli, British, and American counterparts through official channels. The formal requests for information produced formal denials. No intelligence service admits to assassinations in friendly countries, regardless of operational reality. Belgium could suspect whatever they wanted privately, but no evidence would ever support official attribution. The diplomatic understanding was clear. This was intelligence business. Complications weren't welcome. Quiet acceptance was the appropriate response. Bull's family arrived in Brussels and demanded answers. His ex-wife and children met with investigators, hired private security consultants, and pressed for serious pursuit of leads. The private investigators reached the same conclusions as Belgian police. Professional hit, state sponsorship, impossible attribution without intelligence access that would never be provided. The family's grief was genuine, but their search for accountability was futile. Michelle, Bull's daughter, visited the apartment building on Rue Sherrod a week after the murder. She stood in the doorway where her father died, looking at the marble floor that had been cleaned but still showed faint discoloration where blood had pooled. She tried to understand what he'd been thinking in his final seconds, whether he'd known the danger, whether he'd regretted his choices, whether he'd thought of her. The answers died with him, but the questions would persist for the rest of her life. Project Babylon collapsed immediately after Bull's assassination. Iraqi engineers couldn't proceed without his technical expertise. The barrel sections in British custody were eventually destroyed, cut into scrap metal, and recycled. Other components, scattered across Europe, were confiscated or abandoned. The concrete foundations at the Jabal Hamran site in Iraq were later destroyed by coalition bombing during Desert Storm. Bull's Supergun was systematically erased from physical reality, even as it persisted in intelligence files. The deterrent effect was immediate and widespread. Several other engineers working on Iraqi weapons programs terminated their contracts within weeks. A metallurgist consulting on missile guidance systems returned to Germany and refused further communication with Baghdad. A propulsion specialist working on Scud modifications left Iraq abruptly. Bull's death sent a clear message. Weapons designers working for hostile states were legitimate targets. Technical expertise didn't provide immunity from lethal action. The broader arms-dealing community processed Bull's assassination as professional hazard made concrete. Working for sanctioned regimes meant accepting that Western intelligence services might decide elimination was strategically necessary. Some contractors withdrew from controversial markets entirely. Others increased security measures and limited travel to areas where intelligence operations were common. A few continued as before, convinced their work was sufficiently low profile to avoid Bull's fate. The coordination between Israeli, British, and American intelligence on Bull's case became the template for future counterproliferation operations. A classified meeting in London in January 1990 had established the framework. Israeli representatives argued for assassination. British intelligence offered support, but not operational execution. CIA provided intelligence assistance while maintaining official ambiguity. The arrangement was typical: coordination without formal authorization, support without accountability, effectiveness without attribution. Israeli intelligence services never officially acknowledged the operation, but hints emerged gradually over subsequent decades. A retired Mossad officer speaking to a journalist in 2008 described Bull in general terms as a legitimate military target under preemptive self-defense doctrine. Iraq was building a weapons system capable of striking Israeli cities with payloads that existing defenses couldn't intercept. Eliminating the weapon's designer was strategically necessary and morally justified. The officer expressed no regrets about the decision or its execution. British intelligence documents partially declassified in 2015 revealed MI6 had provided surveillance intelligence on Bull's movements and communications intercepts from his Brussels office. The cooperation was described as routine counterproliferation coordination between Allied services. British officials maintained they provided intelligence support only, not operational assistance, and had no direct knowledge of assassination plans. The distinction was legally significant, but operationally meaningless. MI6 knew what Mossad intended and provided the intelligence that enabled the operation. American CIA involvement was documented through Freedom of Information Act releases showing the agency had briefed Israeli intelligence on Bull's Iraq work and provided satellite imagery of the Jabal Hamrain construction site. The briefings occurred in late 1989 and early 1990, directly preceding the assassination. Agency officials insisted the intelligence sharing was standard counterproliferation cooperation, not authorization for targeted killing. The timing suggested otherwise. Bull's assassination established targeted killing as standard counterproliferation doctrine. The Brussels operation demonstrated that intelligence services could eliminate proliferation threats through assassination without triggering diplomatic crises or military escalation. The success validated an approach that would be replicated repeatedly over subsequent decades. Iranian nuclear scientists died in car bombings. Syrian chemical weapons engineers were shot. North Korean missile specialists disappeared during business trips. The pattern Bull's death established continued because it worked. The moral calculation remained brutally simple. Intelligence officials weighed the life of one weapons designer against potential casualties if their work succeeded. Bull versus thousands of potential Israeli casualties if the Supergun became operational. The arithmetic justified elimination from the perspective of threat assessment, even if international law provided no legal basis for the killing. Strategic necessity trumped legal constraints when states decided their security required direct action. Bull's legacy existed in contradictory narratives that were never reconciled. His supporters remembered genuine brilliance in artillery science and innovations that advanced ballistics research. His critics remembered a mercenary who armed dictators and died building a weapon meant to threaten civilian populations. Both perspectives contained truth. Bull was simultaneously genius and cautionary tale, visionary engineer and willing accomplice to mass destruction. His technical achievements survived in weapon systems still deployed decades after his death. The G5 howitzer he designed for South Africa was copied by multiple countries and saw combat on 3 continents. The extended-range artillery principles he pioneered became standard in modern gun design. His innovations killed efficiently, exactly as intended. The engineering succeeded independent of moral questions about his client list. The investigation into Bull's murder remained officially open, but generated no activity after the first year. Desmet retired in 1993, knowing he'd documented a killing he could never prosecute. New detectives occasionally reviewed the case, but each examination reached identical conclusions. Professional assassination, intelligence operation, impossible to pursue without international cooperation that would never materialize. The file was permanently frozen. The Brussels apartment building on Rue Cherred changed ownership twice over the years. The murder's history was disclosed to prospective buyers, but eventually faded into background. The city had accumulated too much history for one assassination to permanently mark a location. Current residents mostly don't know about the killing in their entrance. Bull's death became historical footnote in a city filled with them. 20 years after the assassination, Michelle finally made peace with her father's contradictions. She visited his grave in Canada and acknowledged he was both brilliant engineer and flawed man who convinced himself that technical work existed separate from moral consequences. He'd been wrong about that separation, and the error cost him his life. But he'd also genuinely loved his children and believed his engineering vision would advance human capability. The contradictions would never resolve, but she could finally accept them. The operational team that executed Bull's assassination dispersed to other assignments. The shooter's identity remained protected by classification systems designed to outlast everyone involved. The mission entered Mossad's files as a successful case study known only by cryptonym. Details were accessible only to those with specific operational need to know. The shooter likely received assignments to increasingly sensitive targets based on demonstrated competence in Brussels. Success in that world meant permanent anonymity combined with progressive responsibility for high-stakes operations. The Kidden Unit's methodology was studied by other intelligence services as an example of proper operational execution. The surveillance protocols, the timing selection, the weapon choice, the extraction procedures, everything demonstrated professional excellence. Bull's assassination became training material for targeted killing programs across multiple countries. The operation's success validated the approach and encouraged replication. Bull died believing he was building space access technology, killed by operatives who knew he was constructing a weapon of mass destruction. Both perspectives contained partial truth and significant self-deception. The Supergun could theoretically launch satellites, but was clearly intended for military strikes. The assassination was strategically necessary, but clearly violated international law. The moral complexity was never resolved because resolution would require acknowledging uncomfortable truths about weapons proliferation and the calculations states make when national security conflicts with legal constraints. The truth about Bull's assassination lives in classified files that will remain sealed until everyone involved is long dead. The operational details are protected by security classifications designed to outlast the intelligence generation that planned and executed the mission. The shooter's identity is locked behind layers of protection that will never be penetrated by civilian investigation. Perfect operational security means permanent invisibility. Bull's assassination achieved that standard. The 5 bullets that killed Gerald Bull on March 22, 1990, terminated Project Babylon, established targeted killing as standard counterproliferation doctrine, and demonstrated that strategic interests ultimately override legal protections when states decide security requires assassination. His death was professional execution masquerading as unsolved murder, intelligence success maintained through perfect silence and precedent that shaped operations for decades afterward. His story ended on a doorstep in Brussels with scattered technical drawings and keys still in a lock. But the pattern his assassination established continued indefinitely because the underlying conditions remained unchanged. States wanted weapons, designers provided expertise, intelligence services eliminated threats. Bull's death was one case in an ongoing shadow war against proliferation that would extend long beyond his life. The apartment door still stands on Rue Chéred. Someone lives there now who knows nothing about what happened in that doorway. The city moved on. The investigation closed. The classified files remained sealed. And somewhere, the individuals who planned and executed Bull's assassination live with the knowledge that they killed a civilian engineer in a European capital and faced no consequences because the operation succeeded perfectly. In the world of intelligence operations, perfect success means permanent silence. Gerald Bull's murder achieved that standard. The truth about who specifically authorized his death, who pulled the trigger, and what classified deliberations preceded the killing will likely remain sealed until the last person involved is decades dead, and the strategic concerns that drove the assassination have faded into history. But the precedent survives. The methodology continues, and engineers who consider working for hostile states now have Bull's fate as their cautionary example. The briefcase that fell from his hands contained designs for a weapon that would never be built. The keys remained in his door as evidence photographed and filed. The blood was cleaned from the marble floor within days, but the strategic calculation that ended Gerald Bull's life on a Brussels doorstep persists in classified conference rooms where intelligence officials still weigh individual lives against national security threats and occasionally conclude that assassination is the optimal solution. Bull's death wasn't unique. It was precedent. And precedents, once established, are rarely abandoned.